From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's today's lineup. K-State's Chris Little will talk about the persistent problem of sudden death syndrome in soybean production and what he and other researchers have discovered about contending with it through plant genetics, fungicide treatments, and irrigation management. Also today, from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen is back aboard with us, and he'll talk about the issue of trains blocking railroad crossings, which can be a significant problem for traffic in rural areas. A recent Kansas court ruling calls into question an individual state's ability to regulate the time that trains can do so. And later, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven with Stop, Look, and Listen. All that here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You are tuned to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today, our Wednesday edition. Thanks for listening. Our first guest will actually be with us this and our next broadcast as well, taking a closer look at disease issues in our row crops in Kansas. The one we'll cover here today in soybeans, the other in grain sorghum. We'll take that up tomorrow. But research plant pathologist Chris Little of K-State is alongside. As Chris, we tap you for an update on sudden death syndrome in Kansas soybeans. SDS is still quite prominent out there?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those diseases that has just been slowly increasing in prevalence in Kansas, especially in highly managed, very healthy fields can suddenly turn yellow and leaves start to die, and producers may wonder what's happening in those fields. Certainly isn't something that we see in the droughty years. Charcoal rot's more important in the droughty years, so in the wet years we can really see some sudden death show up, and also in some of our irrigated acreage as well.
So in this past season where the moisture came quite late in the maturity of the crop, did we see SDS?
We did, and we see it in the River Valley, for example, quite often. And of course, that fungus is soil-borne, sits in the soil, and is waiting for those environmental conditions to take over and cause disease. The fungus colonizes roots, so it starts in the soil, moves to the roots, and as it colonizes the roots, it starts to produce a toxin, and that toxin is translocated through the plant to the foliage above, and that's when you start seeing that yellowing and between the veins, some dying. So we call that chlorosis and necrosis, starting between the veins of the leaves. That's when the plants start going down. And the roots will become sort of dead inside or necrotic inside. And sometimes there'll be a little bit of greenish-blue tissue of the fungus that you can see if you pull up the roots too. So those are good signs and symptoms that you can look for if you're curious that you might have an SDS problem.
And obviously when it sets in, it really hammers away at the productivity of that stand.
It does. It really can have a great impact on yield. And that's one of the things that, we look at disease severity, but we are also, the bottom line is interested in the effect that this pathogen has on yield. And research and management is certainly directed at understanding how we can improve yield, understanding that this SDS pathogen is going to be out there, and what we can do to sort of mitigate that, or kind of understand how to mitigate that a little bit better. We have some management techniques that are available for growers. A lot of these root pathogens are very common in heavier soils, waterlogged soils that accumulate that moisture and don't drain well. And so that's always something to kind of be aware of. But what's really interesting is that there's always the co-occurrence, if you will, of the soybean cyst nematode and the SDS fungus seem to go together.
There's some synergy there.
Yeah, there is. The nature of that synergy is not fully understood. Been a lot of kind of work into that. But the point is, one of the best things I think growers can do is test their fields for SCN. They can send in the SCN samples to K-State. They'll get an idea of what the nematode type is, what the population is, so that they can deploy really good resistance to the nematode, because there's specific genetic resistance available in soybeans out there for your different nematode populations. And so if you can control your nematode disease in your plants, then you typically can have some tolerance to the fungus as well. Mm-hmm. So you get kind of a 2-for-1 generally there.
So suppressing soybean cyst nematode, one step. Will fungicide treatments help against SDS, though?
Yeah, there are some products like Ilevo that have been relatively successful in some environments anyway. Some years it seems like it works. Some of our trials at the experiment station show that Ilevo works, and sometimes it doesn't work. I think some of the producers that I've talked to have really great things to say about Ilevo. It's not supposed to be an Ilevo commercial here, but it's certainly a product that will improve the growth and yield of the beans and suppress some of those soil-borne pathogens like SDS as well. So that's certainly an option that growers can try. And, I think seed companies are starting to market SDS resistance. Now, whether or not that resistance is full resistance, which is it's not really, it's more moderate resistance, maybe it's more tolerance to the pathogen, but they are marketing some varieties that have some SDS resistance. Mm-hmm. And I think that producers can look for that and talk to their consultants and extension agents about those things. But we're still looking at resistance. And that's a really important part of what the Kansas Soybean Commission funds my lab to do is look at different ways of trying to address resistance and resistant sources. How do we measure that? I think that's a good way of sort of leading into the topic of how do we measure resistance. And typically, with the field tests that have gone on for a long period of time, look at nematode resistance, look at SDS resistance in the field. But we've also brought some of this plant material into the lab and into the greenhouse to look at components of how these varieties respond to the fungus. Mm-hmm. The first approach is looking at toxin assays. So I mentioned at the very beginning that this fungus makes a toxin that moves through the plant and causes those really unique symptoms, the yellowing and the leaf death that's associated with SDS. So we're measuring the toxin effect, but we're also wanting to measure the pathogen where it comes to being a seedling pathogen too, a root pathogen, because it does both things. Right now we're looking at entries in the Kansas soybean variety trial. We're working with Dr. Bill Shapaw, the breeder at K-State, looking at his germplasm. So using some of these smaller scale techniques to see if we can predict whether they'll be resistant in the field. So those are ongoing projects that are being supported by the Soybean Commission. Mm-hmm. Really interesting to see how this pathogen operates as a toxin producer and as a root and seedling pathogen kind of at the same time.
So you're looking at what's happening with the plant. Are you also, Chris, examining and exploring what's happening culturally with the management of that crop,
Sure.
and if that contributes to SDS?
Yeah, so we've been doing quite a bit of research over the past few years with Eric Atkinson at the Rossville, Silver Lake, Topeka stations, trying to look at some of the cultural questions. We've gone some different directions, and some directions are a dead end, and some directions tell you something, and that's always kind of a fun process to see. One area recently is just looking at nutritional aspects. We've found that phosphorus amendments really improve tolerance to SDS. And the nice thing is that it seems that phosphorus also reduces charcoal rot as well, and reduces the charcoal rot pathogen. So improved phosphorus nutrition seems to be very important for the soybean plant to have good tolerance or good resistance, stronger tissues. I'm not sure what the mechanism is, but to some of these root pathogens.
So amending the fertilizer protocol could help.
Could help, yeah. And so hopefully there'll be more information coming out in that regard. Irrigation, and not just irrigation, but rainfall in general. When we do irrigation studies, we look at irrigation timing, and after 3 years of data out there shows that the greatest increase in disease severity for SDS occurs when you conduct irrigations in the late vegetative stage. So if rainfall irrigation happens after flowering or it happens early in development of the plant, you're okay. It's when it happens near flowering that you seem to have greater SDS. Another area is planting date. What I would say is that there's a very complex interaction between planting date, yield, and severity of the disease. We've looked at this interaction for 4 years in Rossville, and all the data seems to suggest that even though you may have SDS symptoms show up, early planting will overcome or make up for any SDS that you have. So generally, earlier planting results in higher SDS severity, but earlier planting also ends up giving you better yield. All right, so you can sort of cover up those disease effects by moving that planting a little bit earlier, and that's what all the data seems to shout when we look at it.
Good summary on troublesome pathogen in soybean production, to be sure, sudden death syndrome, and some of the important factors we've uncovered about its nature and dealing with it. Chris, as earlier mentioned, we will have you back Mike's side tomorrow, and at that time, take up the subject of mold in grain sorghum, something that more than a few of our growers out there encountered this past fall. Until then, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Chris Little is a research plant pathologist here at Kansas State University. Agriculture Today continues shortly on this, the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. Welcome back, and we resume our regular series on what's going on in the field of agricultural law with Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at Washburn University's School of Law. Welcoming back Roger McEowen for a regular every other Wednesday get-together. Roger, good to reinstall this series, and what we'll take up to do so today is an issue that is quite frequent in our rural areas of Kansas when trains block roadways and crossings. And this is the subject of a recent Kansas ruling, which we'll get into, but give us the overview of the issue.
Well, it is an issue for all the motorists, but it is, I think, of particular interest to those that use rural roadways. And the issue, of course, is the length of time that a train can block a crossing. How long can they sit there or creep across a crossing but keep vehicular traffic from crossing the tracks? Now, I think it's a real big issue, particularly in rural areas, because you might have few, if any, options for detouring around a block crossing, and the options that you might have may take you a long time to get around just to get to the other side. It's not that big of an issue in cities and towns where you have other options if you're in a hurry to get across the tracks. But in rural areas, you may have very limited options, and the ones that you do have may take you a long detour around to get across that track to where you need to go.
It can be the root of frustration for many folks out there. Now, various states do have various laws regarding the duration at which a train can remain parked in a crossing, right?
They do, either at the state level or as well as at the local level, towns and municipalities. They may have statutes, they may have ordinances that list the maximum length of time that a train can block a crossing. But the question that comes up, as we'll get into in this Kansas case in a bit, is can states do that? Or since we're dealing with trains here, is it a matter of federal law? That's going to be the real big issue. But you're right. A lot of states do have statutes that try to set a maximum length of time at which a train can block a crossing.
And just by way of example, those durations or limitations can vary, can they not?
Sure. For example, in Arizona, it's basically a 15-minute length of time that a train can obstruct travel across a crossing. And if they do that for longer than 15 minutes, then the engineer, the conductor, or the other employee of a railroad that is allowing that to happen is guilty of a Class 2 misdemeanor. Now, there's an exception provided in many of these state laws, and Arizona is no exception, and it provides for an unavoidable accident. So if there's the reason the train is blocking the crossing, for example, is because of something beyond the control of the railroad or the people that are responsible for that particular train, then that's an exception. Under Iowa law, there's a 10-minute maximum rule. Indiana law, again, 10-minute maximum rule. Nebraska, which is the home of Union Pacific Railroad, has a very detailed, lengthy statute that deals with an issue. And they also have rules that apply at the municipality, the unincorporated town or village level. And basically, it's a 10-minute delay. If you block the crossing for more than 10 minutes, then you're subject to a whole list of potential statutory violations and potential fines.
And there are other elements as far as who's responsible for blocking and who's going to be accountable for that in terms of fines, so forth. So a lot of details yet in these, right?
Yeah, there are. And again, I would just emphasize that every state is different. It requires different things to happen, different requirements that have to be satisfied for the railroad to be responsible in terms of being in violation of the particular statutory provisions. But in general, we're looking at a time duration of anywhere from about 10 to 20 minutes. Once you get beyond that, then it's going to trigger in most of these states the other rules and requirements that come into play to potentially hold the railroad responsible.
But back to the broader question that this case here in Kansas addresses, are these state laws in their various iterations, are they valid? And spell out what happened here to lead to this ruling we'll talk about, Roger.
Well, we had a decision by the Kansas Court of Appeals that came down in early November, and it involved the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad that operates trains through Bizarre, which is an unincorporated community in the Flint Hills in Chase County. And at issue were two railroad crossings where the main line and the side lines crossed county and town roads, and the side line was used to change crews or let other trains go by on the main line. Well, early one morning, the sheriff got a call that a train was blocking both intersections, and when he arrived on the scene 2 hours later and spoke with the employees of BNSF, they said that they were checking the train, but they didn't state when the train would move. So the sheriff then called BNSF 3 times. The train ultimately remained stopped on both crossings for about 4 hours. So he issued 2 citations in accordance with Kansas law, one for each engine, for blocking the crossings for 4 hours and 6 minutes. Well, that statute that he based those citations on in Kansas bars railroad companies and corporations that operate a railroad in Kansas from allowing trains to stand on any public roadway near any incorporated or unincorporated city or town in excess of 10 minutes at any one time without leaving an opening on the roadway of at least 30 feet in width. And here they were well beyond 10 minutes. They were over 4 hours. Well, BNSF moved to dismiss the citation. They lose at the trial court level. And at the trial court level, there were a lot of citizens down in that part of Chase County that came forth and provided evidence that they couldn't get to work that day. A service technician could not reach a home that didn't have hot water. This occurred in the wintertime and was having heating problems. And BNSF prevented train logs for one of the engines, but those logs showed that one engine was only stopped in Bizarre for 8 minutes to change crews and was not in Bizarre at the time the sheriff had investigated this. And the sheriff later conceded he might have been mistaken as to the numbers on the engines for the citations. But still, the train, there was an engine there. There were 2 engines that were blocking the 2 crossings. There were no train logs for the other engine, and BNSF also stated there could be other alternatives from blocking the crossings, but uncoupling the middle of the train, they said, which was one of the options, would have been time-consuming and unsafe. Well, the trial court ruled against the railroad and entered a fine of $4,200 plus court costs. And from that, BNSF appealed.
And its appeal continued to pursue this notion that federal law actually trumps state law. Talk about what proceeded from here.
And that's the case with respect to railroad companies. The Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act and the Federal Railroad Safety Act are the two laws here, federal laws, that are at issue. And the appellate court in Kansas said those two federal laws preempted Kansas law and that the evidence presented at trial was insufficient to prove a violation of Kansas law to begin with. That was the railroad's argument. The appellate court basically agreed with that. And they said, yeah, federal law, by its express terms, preempts Kansas law. Now, they said the Kansas legislature did have what the court called an admirable purpose for the statute, but it was too specific because it only applied to railroad companies that were blocking crossings. It did not apply to any other type of company. It did not apply to the public at large, just railroad companies. And so they said you can't pick out railroads just for this purpose. And the federal government has jurisdiction to regulate the railways in the United States. This is up to the feds to determine how long a railroad can block a crossing. It's not up to the states.
So the Surface Transportation Board has the final say in these matters. What does this ruling infer or indicate then about all of these state laws and their variations in as far as their validity then, Roger?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know whether this case would be appealed to the Kansas Supreme Court or not. The time frame for making that decision has not expired yet. If it is, I would anticipate the Kansas Supreme Court would follow what the appellate court has done and just simply affirm that. This is likely to be indeed a matter of federal law. The other issue is, if that is true, and I think it is, then this falls back to the various state legislatures, and in particular the Kansas legislature here. Do they want to go back in and take a look at this statute? Is there enough guidance that the court provided to give them to redo the law so that it's not unconstitutional as applying only to railroads, or do we just scrap the Kansas provision entirely and leave it up to federal law? That's an issue for the policymakers in Topeka to determine probably in this next legislative session.
Well, Roger, this case is but a sample of the many things, remarkably many things, that you track regularly on your blog. And we wanted to point folks in that direction and encourage them to take full advantage of the information you provide there. How do they reach that?
Well, it's known as the Agricultural Law and Taxation blog, and about 130 times a year I'll post a detailed article having something to do with agricultural law, such as this topic, or agricultural taxation. I think probably the easiest way to access that is for people to go to my website, which is washburnlaw.edu/Walter, WALTR. That stands for Washburn Agricultural Law and Tax Report. And then off of that home page, on the left-hand side, as you scroll down, on the left side, you'll see a link for the blog, and there's also an email sign-up. So somebody can click on that, fill that information out, and they'll get an email alert every time I add something to the blog. And so they can see the title of it. If it interests them, then they can click on that and read it. If not, then they can just move on. But the easiest way to access it would be right off my homepage of my website.
And it is a quite informative resource. Start by going to washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. And meantime, we're looking forward to having you with us every other Wednesday to get into the latest developments in the field. Roger, many thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
Roger McEowen is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. And we'll return with more on this Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here as we move ahead now with today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The U.S. Senate voted overwhelmingly yesterday afternoon to finalize the new Farm Bill. Just a day after putting the finishing touches on the conference report, the decision to bring the Farm Bill conference report to a quick vote was a surprise announced by Senate Agriculture Committee Chairman Pat Roberts, and the bill was approved on an 87-13 vote. The House should now advance the bill out of its Rules Committee for a final floor vote as well. At a House Republican leadership press conference yesterday, House Speaker Paul Ryan urged House members to vote for the Farm Bill. Although the bill does not contain the stiffer work requirements for food stamp beneficiaries that were in the House bill, Ryan said that the bill strengthens work requirements and boosts work support so that more people are spurred toward opportunities, as he put it. With expectations that the House will approve the Farm Bill, it will be sent on to President Trump, who is also expected to sign the legislation. Now, among the surprise no votes in the Senate, Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa. He has pushed for years for tighter farm payment limits and actively engaged rules. The final conference report largely went with changes made in the House bill that opened up farm payments to extended family members without addressing tighter active engagement requirements to receive payments that Grassley had championed. On the Senate floor, Senator Roberts said the Farm Bill provides certainty and predictability to farmers in all regions and in all crops. The bill, he says, also maintains program integrity for food assistance programs while addressing other key areas such as research funding, lines of credit, and risk management in agriculture. And Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, the ranking member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, emphasized that the Senate worked to create, as she put it, a hard-fought bipartisan agreement to strengthen the diversity of agriculture and the 16 million jobs it supports. She said that we need to be able to sell our agricultural production around the world as well as sell in our own communities. The Environmental Protection Agency and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers yesterday announced their proposed rule to clarify part of the Clean Water Act. Here's more on that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
A new, clearer definition of what constitutes waters of the U.S. and what does not. That is what the Environmental Protection Agency and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers announced Tuesday that they are proposing to do. This comes after months of public comment on WOTUS, which, according to Don Parrish of the American Farm Bureau Federation,
I do believe it's going to be something we can support, primarily because this administration has done so much outreach.
The new WOTUS definition proposal is expected to be published in the Federal Register immediately, with additional public comment accepted for the next 60 days. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue, in a statement, says farmers and landowners welcome this clarification, echoing comments made earlier this year at Commodity Classic.
It doesn't help when our government comes in trying to regulate every ditch that collects water when it rains. And I think you'll see some common sense solutions that you can agree with as we identify and define what the waters of the U.S. versus waters on your fields and farms are.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The USDA's final grain supply and demand report for 2018, released yesterday, contained few major surprises. Here's a look at that from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA Chief Economist Rob Johansson succinctly describes this month's crop report.
Generally, December is kind of a quiet reporting period.
The National Ag Statistics Service had crop production estimates for cotton, citrus, cottonseed, and sugarcane.
Usually, the WASDE keys off of a lot of new information coming out of NASS, and there wasn't a lot this month.
He notes good improvement in citrus production.
Generally, we talk about declines in citrus production, but this year, year over year, we're seeing significant increases from last year, and that's mainly due to the fact that last year was severely affected by hurricane damage.
And cotton production declines in hurricane-stricken states was offset by increases elsewhere.
We saw increased reduction in the size of the crop in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama in particular. Nevertheless, we did see a slight increase in yields in a couple places, in particular Texas and Missouri and Arkansas.
California and Missouri saw record cotton production. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And concerns over cost and hopes that the U.S. and China will resolve their trade tensions are behind a delay by the White House with that second round of payments to producers under the Market Facilitation Program. This according to Reuters. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue said he was negotiating with the White House Office of Management and Budget on the matter and had expected to announce the second tranche of money late last week or early this week. USDA spokesperson Tim Murtaugh told Reuters that the agency was still in the final stages of the process of approving that second tranche of payments. Kansas leads the nation in foreign animal disease planning, training, and exercises. Scarlett Hagens tells us here that members of the state's livestock industry once again will be participating in a foreign animal disease exercise to continue to improve upon Kansas' response plan.
The Kansas Department of Agriculture Division of Animal Health will lead the emergency preparedness exercise December 17th through the 20th from the agency's headquarters in Manhattan. The department will be joined by other state agency employees, federal and local government personnel, university contacts, and industry stakeholders in the simulated foot and mouth disease event. Regularly exercising emergency response plans benefits all involved and helps identify potential gaps in the plan. A 4-day interactive exercise conducted last year resulted in further improvement in the animal disease response plan. This year's preparedness test will build on plans and procedures from previous exercises. The Kansas Department of Agriculture office will serve as the incident command post, while the Kansas Division of Emergency Management and several counties will each activate emergency operations centers as part of the mock exercise. Foot and mouth disease is a highly contagious virus affecting cattle, sheep, swine, goats, deer, and other cloven-hooved animals. Last identified in the U.S. in 1929, it is not a human food safety concern or a public health threat. The 4-day functional exercise in Kansas, titled Rampart, is funded through a grant provided by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. I'm Scarlett Hagens.
That's a glance at today's agricultural news headlines. We'd invite you once more to take advantage of the podcast service that we provide of Agriculture Today. You can visit agtoday.net, and using your podcast app on your mobile device, you could also go about this by typing in the keywords Agriculture Today Kansas. You'll find the program, tap the subscribe button, and new episodes of our broadcast will automatically arrive on your device every weekday. Start with agtoday.net, and this is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
While musical instruments, trumpet and organ, trombone and piano played, I could let my mind go free.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
It has been said that more people die between Thanksgiving and the New Year than similar periods throughout the year. If I look at recent death among family and friends, I have to agree. We have attended several celebrations of life in the last few weeks, more than I like. It was about 10 days ago I was sitting in the campus All Faiths Chapel, celebrating the full life of a friend and colleague. The space was filled. All Faiths Chapel on campus is used for weddings and other celebrations, as well as music recitals. I'm quite familiar with it, and have sat inside listening to whatever the occasion was. However, this time was different, as my mind wandered off. The death of my friend at 84 years old was, I think, a gift to him. He lived a full, active life, not without sorrow. But the end was not easy, and I could be thankful for death, thinking about the laughter and friendship we had shared. While musical instruments, trumpet and organ, trombone and piano played, I could let my mind go free. Looking to the podium, I saw the native stone wall directly behind it. The whole wall, roughly 30-plus feet high by 40-plus feet wide, was built of native limestone. They looked like a heavy veneer stone, but for all I know, they might be full stone cut to different dimensions and laid down in a pleasant course. They were not the big limestone used in a barn construction or seen across our state in the well-known courthouses like McPherson or so many other county courthouses. Every time I drive out to Westmoreland, I look at and enjoy the old courthouse. I hope it will be restored in all its glory. We have used limestone for bridges and homes, even chicken houses. Sitting there, I saw scenes of post-rock country with its miles of fence posts. In the book Land of Post-Rock, Its Origins, History and People by Grace Muhlenberg and Ada Swineford, much information is given, including the geologic timetable with the estimated durations of the various periods. We know millions of years ago we were an inland sea, from hence the deposits of limestone, shales and muds. Not all deposits of limestone are suitable for building materials. The stone wall I was gazing at while the music played might not have been built of the stones used outside, but it was native limestone, and I know its origin was in time gone, long gone. Time measured in millions of years. And here we are celebrating a life of 84 years. A full life lived well. Since I am 86, I wondered about the 2 years already given to me above and beyond his 84 years. How have I used them? What have I learned and experienced in those extra 2 years? I did not walk up to the wall I was gazing at. I was listening to the music and thinking, recalling moments still very vivid. I clearly could hear my friends' full laughter coming from deep inside and merry. One of these days, when the doors are open, I will go inside and take a close look at the stone wall. I want to see if any of those stones show signs of marine life, such as clams or shells. On our land, I found limestone pieces with fossils of marine shells. I've held them in my hand and contemplated the time factor. It's impossible to grasp. Sometimes I've taken a small piece home, let it slide in my pocket. Other times I've placed it back in the creek bed among all the other eroded rock and river gravel to be washed further along as rain water erodes and washes. Standing low in the creeks, I've climbed out and studied the landscape of hills and valleys with bottomland, knowing that all has eroded. I know the deposit was layers of horizontal deposits, settling down and cemented together over time, a long time. You see it in roadside cuts, neatly stratified. As the last note of the trumpet faded away, I came back with my thoughts to the celebration and listened to the speakers, remembering their friend. I think just being there was probably enough, and maybe quietly pledging to oneself to do well in the remaining time given. That will mean for me enjoying the earth we all share, and taking care of that piece we are responsible for, and sharing it. At the university, which by the way has its buildings built of limestone, it's not difficult to gently push students to better themselves, to be able to better others in the short time that we have. The students have always been of interest to me, to help them find their careers among the often chaotic options to choose from, to realize what their own capabilities are and accept their limitations or push even harder to overcome their particular obstacles. I like to think that even clams knew what they were doing. It was not knowing like we know, but they had purpose. I must go and look to see if I can find any critters in the stones of that chapel wall. It would be 30 million years old, or even older.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. With that, our Wednesday edition comes to a close, and we appreciate you being along with us. Please join us again tomorrow, won't you? Meantime, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.